Hello and welcome to A Sunny Book Nook. My name is Sunny, and today I'm going to be bringing to you a stack of science fiction, speculative fiction, magical realism short story collections because I did a part one of this video series of recommendations a few months ago or something. The first video in the series is up in the cards. Oh, I keep on touching this low-key dead plant with my nails. And ignore that. Anyways, I just wanted to highlight some of the short story collections I've read over the years and the speculative fiction that I enjoy, that, the weird shit that I'm into, that really takes the genre to its highest form and uses the narrative to push forward the sort of alternative and genre-bending narratives and forms of exploring things like gender and gender identity and feminist consciousness and feminist being and things like that, things of that nature throughout like speculative fiction, speculative literature. And these are all women authors, usually queer women authors, and yeah, I'm excited to get into these recommendations. The first book I want to talk about is Shit Cassandra Saw by Gwen E. Kirby. This short story collection was really interesting. Jalen from The Bar on the Bookcase DM'd me on Instagram and was like, Sunny, I think you would really fuck with this. And I did enjoy this quite thoroughly. I thought it was a lot of fun, but also quite dark at many points. A lot of the short stories in here are pretty short, honestly. Like there are some that are kind of more flash fiction-y than anything. Oh, also, all of these books were published in the past year or so. So these are all like really recent releases and, up and coming authors that you should definitely keep your eye on if you are looking for young women, young queer speculative fiction, literary figures that, you want to keep tabs on. But anyway, so in this collection, there are a lot of different short stories and narratives that go across different genres and timelines and such. So the first short story is the titular story, Shit Cassandra Saw That She Didn't Tell the Trojans, because at that point, fuck them anyway, is the first short story, and that's like 6 pages long. And then the next short story is A Few Normal Things That Happen a Lot. Each of these short stories is structured pretty uniquely. Like, A Few Normal Things That Happen a Lot is structured with these different paragraphs that talk about like the woman, the fanged woman, werewolf woman, these cockroach woman, these different situations in which a woman goes in these different situations. The next short story is Jerry's Crab Shack, 1 star, and it's like a Yelp review that goes into weird directions. And there are some short stories in here that explore the toxicity and intimacy and the queerness of female friendship and girlhood, and also like a lot of these thematically deal with the constraints of like heterosexual marriage and what that looks like for women's lives. And there are some short stories in here that really remind me of like Lapvona by Otessa Moshfegh in terms of like the vibes and settings and the historical, almost medieval or magical realist vibes. And so yeah, if you would fuck with that, I think you would really enjoy this. It's quite humorous and again pretty dark, but I think it's pretty interesting and the writing is pretty sharp and dry, cut and dry as well. The back says Margaret Atwood meets Buffy the Vampire Slayer in these funny, warm, and furious stories of women at their breaking points, from Hellenic times to today. So it's like all of these different strong female protagonists that sort of doesn't simplify them to just that. They are all kind of gross and weird and strange in their varying ways, as are the stories. And I think that is what is so compelling about them. So yeah, I also think the cover is so gorgeous. Like, why is that so stunning? The design on the back is also just like, this slays. So enjoyed this short story collection. If you like weird fiction, if you like women who write weird fiction and short stories, you definitely got to pick this up. The next short story collection I want to recommend is one that I read pretty recently, and that is Things to Do When You're Goth in the Country and Other Stories by Shavisa Woods. I fucking love this. This is my first read of 2023 and a 5-star read. Like, whoa! When the first book you pick up of the year is a 5-star read, that's when you know that's gonna be a good fucking reading year for you. This book is so fantastic because there are stories in here that are like surreal, but emphasis on the real. Like, it's realism that takes on these things that, like, thematically it's about the backwoods type country, like, you know, hillbilly elegy type bullshit, that type of energy, but it's like actually with a legitimate politic, with a legitimate perspective, because Shavisa Woods is, I think, a lesbian poet who lives in New York and like grew up in like the country. And all of these stories are so interesting, and some of them are not as speculative, are just like realism essentially, but there are more magical realism sci-fi things in here that are just so fucked up, but not more fucked up than the weird relationships that the main characters in each of the stories have with each other. I think so many of the stories in here are just so deeply memorable, as are the settings that are so visceral, of like the Bible Belt, you know, rural, small town, countryside, the biblical poverty, militarism, imperialism, racist logics of this world, as well as what it means to survive and exist as like a young girl or a queer woman in these spaces. Each of these stories explores this in different ways. And well, actually, there's one that was so weird that, but like also so normal. Like, when I say weird, it's not even that it's just strange or a kind of an out there concept delivered in an original way. It's also just like the way it's just so original and brilliant in my mind, like how it's conveyed and the way that the storytelling is done. It's just like, oh wow, like this is a smart writer. Because there's a story in here called Mohawk, and it's about this trans guy who lives in New York City, and he's trying to get with this girl, and she's like an activist type. And so they go to this Palestinian protest, like in Union Square or something. And after this protest, he wakes up the next day and he has the Gaza Strip on his head, like in his hair. And no matter what he does, it's like a recreation, like a real lifetime recreation and model of what's going on at the border of the Palestinian resistance against Israeli settlements and Israeli like bombs and war going on. And it's like all just happening on his head, and like it's everything that happens in the aftermath and during this process that we experience from his perspective is just so, it's wild, of course. But then there's also like more quiet stories of an older woman who has been a part of a Baptist church, I think, or an evangelical church for a while, but the numbers are dwindling, and then she gets roped in by a couple other members into a little meeting, and they are like, okay, you seem pretty open-minded, so we have to bring to you this idea. And she is like kind of worried and apprehensive and not really sure what's going on. I think a lot of these characters face a lot of apprehension and a lot of sort of dealing with people who are very apprehensive and hesitant with approaching them because of their ideas and the limitations of the perspectives from which they are coming to that space because of the nature of their environment. And that the discomfort of that was just delineated in such a way that I was like, oh, this is good material, and this was fantastic. I would highly recommend it if you enjoy weird fiction, and if, you know, you're a goth country girls make do, you know. Oh my god, the fucking plane, like, please calm down. All right, and the next short story collection I want to talk about is Gods of Want by K-Ming Chang. And I think this author's agent emailed me and sent me this book, and that was so fucking kind. I really appreciate them doing that for me. That's wow. But I really enjoyed this. Each one of these short stories is so dense and brilliantly wrought in this rich and engrossing way. And it's also very like gross and bodily in a in a way that's very like almost like Melissa Broder-esque. The writing is just so rich and dense and finely wrought, but all the stories are so deeply informed by the author's like Chinese American and lesbian identity and perspective, and it's so clear in each and every one of these stories. But each and every one of the stories are still so different, but they deal with like themes of family and intergenerational relationships and like sisterhood and friendship and queer intimacy and like identity and trauma and all of these things in a way that is so poetic. I highlighted so much of the writing because and like took so many underlines and like notes on this shit because I was just like, wow, it's quite brilliant. I just think that the way that this author uses form and narrative is very original and also so like I just had to really slow down and consume this in a way that gave justice to the texture that the words were providing and the imagery that it was drawing out. Just the magnetic way that it played with language and how each of the stories felt so alive, yet distinct in their sort of like vagueness. So yeah, would definitely recommend this, and I think this was also a pretty recent release, like 2021 or 2022. And then the next book I want to talk about is Sarahland by Sam Cohen, which is a queer, weird, speculative short story collection, of course. But in Sarahland, we're following all these different Sarahs and in different situations. The first story, I think, is about a girl who is in a dorm, like a Jewish girl dorm essentially, and it's like all the drama and bullshit that emerges kind of within the sexual politics of like of that. There's also a story in here where like a Sarah turns into like a tree. There's so many strange ones in here that all have to, you know, surround like Sarahland as like an idea essentially. And there's also a story in here called Naked Furniture where this girl works as an escort who like pretends to be furniture or like doesn't move for the like the Johns and the clients who comes in. Strange, of course, and it sort of explores that setting. There's a short story that deals with this girl who is like in this erotic obsession with someone who she calls like her twin, I think, and she also deals with it by writing Buffy the Vampire Slayer fanfiction. So it's just like very strange scenarios that get delineated through the framework of Sarahland as like a concept, and that is just so interesting. I think I love a short story collection that is very, very strange and unabashed about it. I think the last story in here deals with environmental collapse. It's like all the Sarahs are dead and because of the world has ended essentially. There's a story in here that deals with the first Sarah and the biblical story of Sarah in the Old Testament, and it's just quite interesting and I liked it. It's a very, of course, Jewish, feminist, queer short story collection that obviously comes from the mind of like a brilliant young woman writer. And yeah, I liked it. I think it was original, creative, and interesting. And then finally, I want to talk about one of my favorite books of last year, Fruiting Bodies by Catherine Harlan. I talked about this in my favorite books of 2022 video, of course, and it's just amazing. Each one of these stories is, of course, exploring lesbian relationships, queerness and intimacy of girlhood, or these weird speculative like realities or futures or magical elements to isolation or to almost fairy tale like narratives. Each narrative in here feels like its own whole story, but they're of course each short stories, but it's like they just feel like such perfect short stories. Like, this doesn't need to be a novel, this doesn't feel like a poem, this feels like a short story that tells me something really definitive with a beginning, middle, and end, with these really strong, distinct characters in a world that is so concrete to me, and these relationships that feel so real, but with elements of unreality that are absolutely so fascinating and brilliant. I think the concepts that are explored in here are so interesting, and I hopefully by the time this video goes up, my essay on one of the short stories in here that's one of my favorites will be up, and I will link that below. I think this is also this author's debut novel, perhaps. I'm not sure, but it's so original and magical in every way. I love it so much. So you should definitely read this. But yeah, those are all of the queer, feminist, speculative, magical realism short story collections I want to hawk at you today. Let me know if you've read any of these and if you would recommend them as well. And if you haven't, let me know which one seems most interesting to you. But until then, like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you in my next video, hopefully. Bye!